I think we're ready.
Reynolds Provisions.
Reynolds Provisions. You are Rebecca Reynolds of Reynolds Provisions.
Yes.
So why don't you introduce yourself, Rebecca, better than I just did, and then I'll introduce myself.
My name is Rebecca Reynolds. I have been an educator almost my entire adult life. I won't tell you how old I am because I'm older than my non-gray hairs tell you. I am adjunct professor with Concordia University in Chicago. I am also an education director for international preschool curriculum. I am also the chairman for Reynolds Provisions. And a huge part of my work has to do with social emotional learning.
Right. Very good. Terrific. I'm Mike Moscolo. I am a professor of psychology at Merrimack College. I am the academic director of the Compass program there, which is designed to help students move through their first year in a developmentally sensitive way. I'm also the director of Creating Common Ground, a nonprofit that is devoted to helping people bridge divides on difficult, contentious social and political issues. So that's us. And so it seems to me that socio-emotional development is very much part of the core of what it is that we're trying to do in the various things that we're doing. So
yeah, I think the difference between you and myself is that I work on the social emotional learning of children and you work on it with adults.
That makes a lot of sense. That's exactly right. Yep, that's good. That's it. And being a developmental psychologist, and are you a developmental psychologist? What is your psychological background? You're an
Educational psychology.
Educational psychology. Good. So we both got the kind of the lifespan is seamed up there.
Exactly.
So what do you say? So what in your view, what is socio-emotional development? Why is it important?
That is a very full question. Social emotional development impacts everything. It impacts everything, including brain development. From the very beginning of life, at the moment of birth, is when your brain is developing at its fastest rate it ever has or ever will. And throughout your lifespan, it continues to develop and only stops at death. However, during that continuum, the development progressively slows. So at the very first years of life, it's vitally important that children receive nurturing, kindness, and polite direction in how to behave in their own emotions. They're not born knowing how to handle emotion. So with good guidance, they will learn it and it will encourage their brain development to stay along the lines of learning it appropriately. Second time in your life, at the beginning of pre-adolescence, during adolescence years, there is something called pruning. And the parts of your brain, the neurons of your brains that aren't being used are pruned away. They're cut away. So when a teenager forgets something, they might have actually physically forgotten it. This is also an important stage in social emotional learning because forgetting something that you're supposed to remember can do a lot to your self-esteem, especially if the adults in your life are not guiding you with consistency and love.
Yes, it's funny. I just recently read a paper by Richard Lerner of Tufts. And I think the first words of it were, adolescents are not resilient.
They are not.
And the idea is that, they need to learn resilience. That needs to be something that's cultivated through their relationships. So when you said children aren't born having this emotional intelligence or what have you, it's right through lifespan, and we have to develop it right through lifespan, it seems to me.
Exactly.
point of entry into socio-emotional learning is I taught for a long period of time college students, and I've been very, very frustrated with the difficulties that many college students go to college with less than stellar academic skills, and in my view, they leave college with less than stellar academic skills quite often. And what we do in order to help our students is we try to come up with the best quote unquote teaching methods that we can. We try to package the information in the right way or some such thing. We look at that, how it is that we teach. But what we don't do, it seems to me, is the thing that's the most important, is to understand that you can't have any academic learning if it's not built upon a solid foundation of non-cognitive skills. The non-cognitive skills are as important, if not more important, than the academic skills. Heckman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, has made a big part of his career based upon that idea that what we need is to be able to teach non-cognitive skills to students, to children, right from the start. This is the core of their capacity to enter into the labor market, to do well in school. And so by these non-cognitive processes, for me, are things like emotional self-regulation, emotional regulation, the capacity to recognize emotions and persevere through struggle.
Not only recognize them, but recognize how to handle them effectively. I'm constantly, when I worked with children, also with my own 7 children, when I worked with children and they became angry and frustrated and didn't know how to handle it, I would tell them, it's okay to feel angry. The important thing is what you do next.
So you're making a distinction between the feeling itself and then the regulation of the feeling, how it is that we manage the feeling in our social relationships and that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Strikes me as the most important thing. You've got both. I'm able to feel the feeling, the loving support that you seem to be communicating to me, that underlies the idea you should be able to. It's okay to feel that feeling. You can even feel angry. But now what do we do? Now what do we do? To support you both with love and guidance, but at the same time, forward direction.
And the younger they are, the more simplistic the explanation to them, of course, to make it age developmentally appropriate.
And of course, it starts even before language.
It does.
It starts, when the caregiver and the infant are in interaction, and I'm smiling and engaging in that lovely emotional dance with the infant, and then the infant looks away. And when the infant looks away because the infant's feeling overwhelmed by the interaction, that's a form of emotional regulation. And how I respond to that, am I going to keep going? Am I going to pull back? We're teaching emotional regulation, as you said, right from the start.
Exactly. And infants crying. How many generations have you heard to let the infant in the crib cry itself to sleep? Now, the younger they are, newborn through 3 months, perhaps, they're crying because they need something. They need to be held. They need a bottle. They need a diaper change. These are all very important things to try and figure out. As an infant grows older, they start to think, when I make this noise, somebody responds. So they start experimenting with crying to make a crying noise to get somebody to respond. At that point, perhaps teaching the child to stay in bed, even though they're upset they're in bed and not playing, is a good thing. But when they're in the first several months, they need to know that you're there for them. It's vitally important.
Yeah. So what you're suggesting to me is, even in infancy, we have to be really, really keenly aware of the infant's needs and developmental levels at all times, which is hard. So
Yeah.
the very young infant who's crying needs something.
Yes.
The older infant, the 8-month-old, the 9-month-old or whatever, is beginning to engage in a more deliberate dance with you. And then the question of your values comes in. Do we want the kid to sleep through the night? Do we not want is it okay that they don't sleep through the night? Maybe they sleep
Right.
with us. That's a matter of values. And there's going to be different styles of emotional regulation that develop out of those two. Maybe one's not necessarily better than the other, but they're two different styles.
Exactly. And there's different parenting styles. There's different personalities, not only with the parents and caregivers, but with the infants themselves. So there's a lot of different variables, and you called it a dance, and that's pretty much what it is. It's a dance between the two, trying to figure out each other.
I wonder if you would be willing. You told me a story when we talked yesterday about your work in an inner city school with a young student who had difficulty, but then how it is that you got through to that student through what you're talking about right now, through this socio-emotional connection. Can you tell us that story?
Sure. Well, I had done some work in Head Start, and I was in a classroom. I was the only Caucasian in the school, which meant that all of my students were Black, and many of them had not ever seen a Caucasian person before. The parents there were very offended that I was teaching their children, and most of the children were showing signs that the parents were speaking about this at home. And one child in particular, just let's just say every day I went to work, I came home with bruises and bite marks all over me through throwing chairs, and it was incredible. Well, I had a conversation with mom, and mom wasn't too keen on talking to me at first. It took a few times to get her attention. She grew a likeness for me through this and other conversations, and through that, she started changing the way she spoke about me to her son. Then she started speaking to the other parents. Then the other kids started behaving. It became an environment where trust and admiration filled the classroom. It took a good 5 months. So now we have 20 children, their families, and whoever else they come in contact with and discuss this with now have a positive thing to look upon when it comes to the white population. Just one experience in one classroom helped to change the lives of 20 families.
Yeah, actually, it strikes me as more than just one experience, a 1,000, 10,000 micro experiences, which make up that one experience that seem to have that effect.
Yeah, my first week there, I was I was terrified to go back the next Monday, but I'm so glad I did.
You remember you said something about how you said something to the mother that the mother felt very emotional about. Do you remember what that was?
I said a few things. I don't remember which one I told you, but I had told her that her son was very intelligent, that her son will make something of himself if she supports him.
You also said, I'm not going to give up on your son.
Yes, I did.
Yes. So what was that like for you to say that? Why did you say that? Why did you say that? Was there any idea in your head that you would give up or
no, but I could see the expression on her face. And it's kind of a mantra I've had since I was a teenager. I will not give up. And when mom, she wouldn't even look me in the eye. She kept looking at the ground or her shoes. And to me, that communicated shame, that she was feeling shameful. And I wanted her to feel comfortable with me.
Mm-hmm. What do you think she was feeling shameful about?
There's so much in a person's life when, one, you're a minority, two, your income level is less than poverty, but you're working as hard as you possibly humanly can. Three, you have a child you can't support even though you're working really hard. The self-esteem and those three influences it's amazingly downhearted.
Plus, there was the idea that the child was misbehaving in the classroom,
Right.
may have also been a source of frustration or shame on her part.
Oh, completely. If she's working 2, 3 jobs, how is she going to be home to teach her child how to self-control, how to behave? She can't. So just getting the moment to speak.
We're on again.
She didn't have the time that's needed to give the emotional support to her child, even though she was working so hard. So when this happens, the child's left behind. But if she doesn't work, then her child doesn't have the physical needs met.
What I find so compelling about the story that you're saying to me is that you have in front of you a kid who you experience as misbehaving in the classroom. You've got bruises. No one would have blamed you for not going back. You've got a complicated situation where there is a race relation going on here. There are expectations perhaps on both sides about what that means. You got a mother who's looking down. You're experiencing her as having some degree of shame. And what you did, it seems to me, is you accepted her. You accepted this person, and you said, whatever it is that you're feeling right now, it's okay. I'm not going to give up on your son. I'm not blaming you for this. And so that there was care and support and compassion for this person. But not just that, it seems to me, because then once you began to establish that relationship, again, it's the relationship, stupid, it seems to me.
Exactly.
She was able to trust you more, and she was able to help her child trust you more.
Yes.
What
and
did
then
you
and then in turn it spread through the classroom.
I want to talk about that system in just a few minutes. Before though, could you tell me more about what you did in the classroom to move that child and perhaps the other children forward who were misbehaving, if you will?
Well, there are a couple different steps that I did. The first one was I established a regular routine. By establishing a regular routine, the kids learn security. They know what to expect. They know what comes next. They're not afraid because they understand what's going to happen. The next thing I did was I made sure that when I spoke to them, I was eye-to-eye level. I was either sitting in a child-sized chair or sitting on the floor, so that when I spoke to them, they didn't feel like they had to look up at me physically. Another thing that I did was I spent time with each child. I found a way every week to spend at least 10 to 15 minutes alone with each child, whether it be on the playground, during my lunch break, or whether it be in the classroom during a free play time. I sat with each child for 10 to 15 minutes every week. Just by spending time with the child and listening to them speak and modeling the correct way to speak, we develop a rapport, a relationship of back and forth, and they learn to trust. I had one little girl in there that she broke my heart. so many times. Her self-esteem was so low. It was incredible. She really played with the kids, and she didn't search out kids to play with, and they didn't search her out. It wasn't until I started sitting down and playing with her that the other kids started getting involved. And I asked her why she doesn't want friends. It's a pretty blunt question. I just came out and said it. And she looked me eye to eye and she said, because I'm ugly and they don't want me. She was 5 years old.
Hmm.
And then I said to her, do you see me playing with you? She just kind of nodded her head. You know, she's starting to cry, so she's not speaking. She's just nodding. I said, I don't play with ugly people. The hug she gave me was just intense. And before she left that day, I looked at her, I said, I think you're the most beautiful person I have ever met. And she just glowed for the rest of the school year. She developed a couple of new friends. And this was 9 years ago. I'm Facebook friends with her mom, and she's got friends. And I've stayed in contact with a few of the families. So I'm able to follow a couple of them, which is kind of nice. It's a nice thing.
I can't imagine that the behavior problems that you encountered early on simply went away overnight.
Oh,
So
no.
I'm curious about if you can give an example or two about the types of ways in which you handled that. Again, you know, with connection and guidance, which is what you're talking about right now. It seems. Could you give an example of what it is that you felt worked to transform those behaviors?
Sure. Conversation and empathy. When a child lashes out, in this particular classroom, when a child lashed out, they'd throw something or hit someone, something along those lines. I sat down with the children involved. And I looked at the child who was hurt first. I asked how they were doing. Does it hurt a lot? Do you think you'll be okay? And I did this because the child who did the hurting needs to understand that there is a reaction to their behavior. Then after we got them ice or whatever needed to happen for that child who was hurt, the child who was doing the hurting helped with the whole process. They had to get the ice or the Band-Aid or whatever it was this child needed. Then the child who was hurt left to go play. Then the child who did the hurting, we had a conversation. How do you think that made your friend feel? Why did you do that? What were you feeling? And then we discuss feelings and how to handle it when they have that feeling again. How do we handle it better next time? What can you do when you don't know how to handle it? So we give them steps to follow. So in that instance, in many of the instances of this classroom, their answer was to come to the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I would direct them, that's a perfect thing to do. If you don't know how to handle it, ask an adult who you can trust, and they'll help you. And throughout the school year, this is how it was repeatedly done. And like I said, routine is very important. The structure and routine that you follow is very important at the younger ages because it gives them a sense of trust. So if you do it the same way every time, they learn to trust it.
Mm-hmm.
Then by the end of the school year, we didn't have no incidents, but no one was getting hurt. So
Yeah.
I see that as a win-win. You know, we still had a couple of no, I don't want to kind of situations, but no one was getting hurt.
Um, what I find so important and remarkable about what you're saying is how it all forms a system. How it all forms a system. So my complaint about what people talk about when they talk about socio-emotional learning, especially when we talk about socio-emotional learning programs in schools and that sort of thing, is the idea of separating socio-emotional learning, from academic learning. So here we are, we're doing our academic learning in the classroom. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And socio-emotional learning, well, they need socio-emotional learning, so we need a program for socio-emotional learning. So we'll have a socio-emotional learning class or a socio-emotional learning hour, or we'll have some sort of a book that they read on socio-emotional. It's like, okay, now it's time to do socio-emotional learning. And that's
That's
disruptive.
ludicrous.
Nonetheless, I think it's and what I want to suggest is two things. I want to make two comments. One is what I want to call the grandmother comment, and the other is the systems comment. Let's start with the grandmother comment. Grandmothers, at least the fantasy grandmother in my head, are special people, because they'll make you a lasagna, and they'll knit you a sweater, and they will love you to death. But then they'll knock you upside the head, metaphorically, not physically, perhaps in days of yore, more physically, and say, you got to get in line. No, you can't touch those pots. Those are my pots. You have to, don't do that. No, this is the way you behave. And every time the grandmother does that out of love, 1,000 things happen. So when you just were describing how you intervened with someone who threw the chair, you didn't do one thing. You did 1,000 things all at once, it seems to me. You said, you went to the other kid first. Not only does that help that kid understand that there are consequences and that kid matters and that shouldn't be happening, but it alerts the other kid, the perpetrator, if you will, to the idea that there are consequences. How does this person feel? The teacher thinks that this person's important right now, and this hurt is important right now.
Exactly.
Didn't throw the person into some timeout or some punishment. And then you got on the person's level, on the thrower's level, and you talked with them about emotion, about how the other child felt, and you were being nice, but you weren't being nice. You weren't being nice. You weren't just being nice. We have this idea that socio-emotional development is about being nice. No, it's about
it's not.
About being
It's
caring
and firm and understanding.
And teaching and knowing that the stability that you're providing that student is going to help that student. The student's autonomy, capacity to regulate emotions, as you said before, it doesn't just spontaneously emerge. It has to be taught.
Exactly.
You're teaching them through love and direction at the same time. And
that is so true.
Then the system comes. Again, we tend to think that, one person's teaching another person something. No, there's a triad there. There's you, the kid who was hurt, and the kid who did the hurting. And then all the rest of the kids watching. And then the parent of the kid who you are developing a relationship with, who then helped the child form a relationship with you. And then there's a contagion that spreads throughout the entire class. So my complaint about socio-emotional learning being this thing that you teach over there in a separate module, you create a program for it. In my view, those ways of thinking are flawed.
They are.
It's the systemic grandmother model. If you, we go in there and we are relating to these kids as people with care, love, guidance, values, and we're in their faces, it seems to you, but not in a punitive way. We don't act in order to punish, but we act in order to promote development. This is what I see in the wonderful example that you've given.
Well, thank you. That was my goal.
Also, what I think is not going on sufficiently in our schools.
I completely agree. And that's part of the reason why social emotional learning is such a big part of Reynolds provisions.
Mhm.
Um, children that don't have what they need, when I see that, it breaks my heart.
You know,
And the majority of the time, the item they need the most is their social emotional learning. And like you said, social emotional learning should not be taught as a unit. It should be an everyday, on the spot, every minute, effective teaching tool.
right. But there's a sense to which I think that, at least in our contemporary culture, that we're afraid to do that. We're afraid to do that because if we do that, then we are stating a value. We're saying, this is the way you should behave, and that is the way you should not behave. And to act on the basis of values, especially in a public classroom, I think it's very threatening to many teachers. I think that they're afraid to do so. I think that they feel as though that they're imposing their values onto students or something like that. And there's a fear that goes on.
I can see that. Um, the thing about social emotional learning is when it's done appropriately, you're getting the student to think for themselves. You're asking open-ended questions to get them to think about it. For example, the hurtee, when I was helping the child who was hurt, the child who did the hurting was watching and listening to the conversation. Then when I turn around and speak to the child who was doing the hurting, I listened to their explanation. Then I would ask open-ended questions like, why do you think that hurt your friend? What can you do differently next time? It gets them to start thinking about other options. It's not putting my thoughts into their head. I'm not teaching them what I want them to know. I'm teaching them to think for themselves.
Interesting. I have several reactions to that. Again, you're doing 1,000 things at once with a seemingly innocent, simple question. You're doing 1,000 things. The question is not simply a question. It's a pull for thought. It's an attempt to get people to think for themselves. And it's getting them to think for themselves in the context in which they do something. That's really exciting. In addition, and I don't think that this may sound like a disagreement, but I don't think it is actually. When we say we're trying to get the child to think for him or herself, and that we're not putting ideas into the kid's head, I get what you're saying. You didn't say to the kid, here's the rule, which that's something I don't think is a bad thing to do at all. But we're not saying that here's the rule. You're asking these open-ended questions. Of course, the questions are not fully open-ended. And you asked the question. You asked that question. You could have asked a different question. The mere fact that you asked that question suggests that there's a value framework. It's inescapable. It can't not be there. There's a value framework that's there. You ask the question pulls for the student, orients the student in this direction rather than that direction. So what it seems to me that you're doing is you've got the kid involved and thinking within a context of a set of values, however implicit, that are constraining and directing where that kid's thinking and emotion. So you're doing both, it seems to me. I think that what many people do is they make the error of thinking that if I'm going to ask an open-ended question and I'm not going to put my value into the child, that you're letting the kid choose his or her own values. You're leaving the kid alone to do his or her own thing. You're hands off, when in fact it's absolutely the opposite. You know, many people will say, for example, a Montessori classroom is a classroom where they're hands off, where the kid is creating his or her own development. That's so not true. The Montessori classroom is extraordinarily structured. It's structured in such a
It
way
is.
that the kids' choices are constrained in a way that
And
allows them to act. But
it's actually so structured that in order to go to a public school after receiving Montessori, they have to go through training in how to behave in a structured school, in a public school system.
exactly. Hey, I want to address an elephant in the room.
Okay.
So here's these two white people, ostensibly white people, one a white male, talking about a story about a white female who goes into a predominantly Black school, where you talked about attitudes that that the kids and the parents had towards you, the difficulty that you had not wanting to go back. You know, it's very hard to not hear the voice that says, who are you to say anything about all of this? You know, are you some savior that's going to go in and save the Black school or something like that? Aren't you? You know, we don't need that from you. We need something else. So, I mean, that's a difficult issue. What are your thoughts about it? What would you say to somebody who were to say to you, you know, we don't need you're from the outside. What we need is somebody from the inside.
My very first day at Head Start was actually at a different school. And my now 24-year-old son was 2 years old at the time and came to work with me. Very white, and his pigment was so white at the time that you could see his veins because he's just white. I walked up to the door and it was locked, so I knocked. And one of the teachers opened the door and said, just kind of stared at me and said, "What do you want?" So I put my hand out to shake hers to introduce myself, and she put her hands behind her back. They obviously were not expecting me. So I told her, I said, "Well, I'm Rebecca, your new director." The look of shock on her face was just unreal. She let me in. And that particular teacher ended up being my son's teacher at this Head Start. And JT came home telling me, one, he never calls me mama. It was always mom. He said, "Mama, I'm a white boy." I said, "Yes, JT, you are." He said, "But can I make friends with the Black kids?" Of course. Yes, make friends. It's amazing how many people are prejudiced the opposite way. I mean, when in a lot of the circles of prejudice, you hear about the whites being prejudiced against the Blacks, but everybody's prejudiced against everybody. We're all, I believe we're all one race. We're the human race. Mm-hmm. That's my theory on it. Mm-hmm. What I tell them is, I'm doing my job. This is what I do. This is my job.
Yeah, I agree with you about we are one race. There is no race, actually. We are one race. I mean, there are no biological, there's no biological markers for race. There's no categories that demarcate what we call one race or separate one race from another race. There's a continuity. There's a full continuity between the variations in human phenotypes. And we indeed impose racial categories upon them. And then we create these prejudices about them that get reinforced. At the same time, it would be very difficult to ask someone not to identify themselves necessarily with a racial category or a racialized category after having done so an entire a lifetime. What is that?
Mhm.
How do you do that? How do you do that? So we really have this problem of how it is that we can reconcile our racialized identifications with the fact that that there are no races in nature. There is variation, there is human variation, but there are no races.
I find that people are afraid of what they don't know. And that fear leads to bad things the majority of the time.
Yes, and that it takes courage to face the things that we don't know, especially to face the things that we don't know, that we think we know, and that we have a great deal of emotional
Atta-
investment, or
yes.
perhaps
It's very hard to be open minded sometimes. I think everybody has that challenge, some a lot more than others, but
well, on that note, let's plan for another open-minded attempt to be open-minded for another number. Let's this might be a good way to close. So
okay.
let's close on this. I think that was really really stimulating and rich for me. The idea that socio-emotional development combines love and direction in everyday culture is what I take away from what you did and what you're doing, and I think it's very powerful.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Let's do it again.